The revival of Hebrew as a community language. 1. When did Hebrew develop from a religious book language to be a community language? The revival of Hebrew as a community language began in earnest in the late 19th century, primarily driven by the Zionist movement. 2. What languages did Jewish people speak among themselves among the communities they lived in? Historically, Jewish communities developed their own languages, often influenced by the local languages of the regions they inhabited. These languages were known as Judeo-languages, and included Yiddish, primarily spoken in Eastern Europe, Ladino, spoken in the Iberian Peninsula and Ottoman Empire, and Judeo-Arabic, spoken in various Arab-speaking regions. 3. Who worked on developing Hebrew to be a community language and which? One of the most prominent figures in the revival of Hebrew was Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. He was a Hebrew language scholar and activist who dedicated his life to revitalizing Hebrew as a spoken language. His work included creating a Hebrew academy. Ben-Yehuda founded the Hebrew Language Academy in Jerusalem, which aimed to standardize the Hebrew language and promote its use in daily life. Writing a Hebrew dictionary, he compiled a comprehensive Hebrew dictionary, including new words and phrases that were necessary for modern communication. Raising awareness. Ben-Yehuda actively promoted the use of Hebrew in education, literature, and public life. 4. When and how? The revival of Hebrew began in earnest in the late 19th century, primarily in Palestine, now Israel. It was fueled by the Zionist movement, which sought to create a Jewish homeland. Hebrew was seen as a unifying language that would help to create a strong Jewish identity and culture. 5. What other languages used to make the now Hebrew language? While Hebrew has ancient roots, it has been influenced by other languages over the centuries. Some of the languages that have contributed to the development of modern Hebrew include Aramaic, a Semitic language that was widely used in the ancient Near East. Aramaic influenced Hebrew grammar and vocabulary. Greek. During the Hellenistic period, when Jewish communities were dispersed throughout the Greek-speaking world, Hebrew was influenced by Greek vocabulary and syntax. Latin. After the Roman conquest of Judea, Hebrew came into contact with Latin, which also influenced its development. It's important to note that while these languages influenced Hebrew, the core of the language remained distinctly Hebrew. Eliezer Ben-Yehuda was a pivotal figure in the revival of the Hebrew language. His contributions were multifaceted, but some of his most significant actions included 1. Founding the Hebrew Language Academy. He established the Hebrew Language Academy in Jerusalem in 1912. This institution played a crucial role in standardizing the Hebrew language, creating new words and phrases, and promoting its use in daily life. 2. Writing a comprehensive Hebrew dictionary. Ben-Yehuda dedicated much of his life to compiling a comprehensive Hebrew dictionary. This dictionary included new words and phrases that were necessary for modern communication, helping to expand the language's vocabulary and usage. 3. Promoting Hebrew education. He advocated for the use of Hebrew as the primary language of instruction in Jewish schools. This helped to ensure that future generations would be fluent in Hebrew and contribute to its continued development. 4. Using Hebrew in daily life. Ben-Yehuda was a strong advocate for the use of Hebrew in all aspects of daily life. He spoke Hebrew at home, wrote in Hebrew, and encouraged others to do the same. His personal example served as an inspiration to many who were working to revive the language. 5. Creating a Hebrew-speaking community. Ben-Yehuda's efforts helped to create a vibrant Hebrew-speaking community in Palestine, now Israel. This community provided a supportive environment for the language and helped to ensure its survival. In essence, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda was a visionary who dedicated his life to the revival of Hebrew. His tireless efforts and contributions were instrumental in transforming Hebrew from a religious book language into a living, spoken language. Prior to Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's efforts in the early 20th century, the primary language spoken by Jewish communities in Palestine was Yiddish. This was especially true for Ashkenazi Jews, who had immigrated from Eastern Europe. While some Jewish communities, particularly those with Sephardic or Mizrahi heritage, may have spoken other languages like Ladino or Judeo-Arabic, Yiddish was the dominant language among the Jewish population in Palestine during that time. The Jewish population in Palestine in 1912. Estimating the exact Jewish population in Palestine in 1912 is challenging due to the limited and sometimes contradictory historical records. However, various sources suggest that the Jewish population was significantly smaller than the Arab population at that time. Estimates range from around 60,000 to 80,000 Jews living among the Palestinian Arab population. It's important to note that these figures are approximate and may vary depending on the specific sources and methodologies used. Languages spoken by Jewish communities in 1912. As mentioned in previous responses, the primary language spoken by Jewish communities in Palestine in 1912 was Yiddish. This was especially true for Ashkenazi Jews, who made up the majority of the Jewish population at the time. However, other languages were also spoken, depending on the specific community's background and origin. These included Ladino, spoken by Sephardic Jews, particularly those from the Iberian Peninsula and Ottoman Empire. Judeo-Arabic, spoken by Mizrahi Jews, especially those from Arab-speaking regions. Hebrew. While Hebrew was primarily a religious language at this time, it was starting to be revived as a spoken language, particularly among Zionist activists and intellectuals. It's worth noting that many Jewish individuals were bilingual or even trilingual, speaking multiple languages depending on their social and cultural context. Language interactions between Jews and Palestinians in 1912. While it's true that many Jewish immigrants to Palestine in the early 20th century primarily spoke Yiddish, it's important to remember that language interactions between Jews and Palestinians were not always limited to Yiddish. Bilingualism. Many individuals, both Jewish and Palestinian, were bilingual, speaking both Arabic and another language. This was especially true for those who had lived in diverse communities or had experience interacting with people from different backgrounds. Language learning. As Jewish communities grew in Palestine, there was an increasing need for Jewish individuals to learn Arabic to interact with their Palestinian neighbors and participate in the broader economic and social life of the region. Government and public services. In government offices and public services, such as the Palestine Railways, Arabic was likely the primary language of communication. However, some employees, particularly those from Jewish communities, may have also spoken Yiddish or other languages. Therefore, while Yiddish was a common language among Jewish communities, it was not the only language spoken in interactions between Jews and Palestinians. The extent of language mixing and bilingualism varied depending on individual circumstances, social networks, and the specific context of the interaction. 10. Palestinian population in 1912. Estimates for the Palestinian Arab population in 1912 range from around 600,000 to 700,000. These figures are based on various demographic studies and censuses conducted during that period. It's important to note that these estimates are approximate and may vary depending on the specific sources and methodologies used. However, they generally indicate that the Palestinian Arab population significantly outnumbered the Jewish population in Palestine at that time. Arabic-speaking Jews in Palestine in 1912. While the majority of Jewish immigrants to Palestine in the early 20th century were Ashkenazi Jews who primarily spoke Yiddish, there was also a significant population of Arabic-speaking Jews. These Jews were primarily of Sephardic or Mizrahi origin and had lived in Arab-speaking regions for centuries. Estimating the exact number of Arabic-speaking Jews in Palestine in 1912 is challenging, as historical records are often incomplete or inconsistent. However, it is generally believed that they constituted a significant minority of the Jewish population. Some of the main sources of Arabic-speaking Jews in Palestine included Sephardim, Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century and settled in various parts of the Mediterranean, including North Africa and the Middle East. Mizrahi Jews, Jews who lived in various Arab-speaking regions, including Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Egypt. Local converts, individuals who converted to Judaism from the local Arab population. It's important to note that while these Jewish communities primarily spoke Arabic, they also maintained their own distinct cultural and religious traditions. Many Arabic-speaking Jews continued to use Hebrew for religious purposes and preserved elements of their ancestral languages, such as Ladino or Judeo-Arabic. Jewish communities in Palestine in 1912. Estimating the exact breakdown of the Jewish population in Palestine in 1912 according to their origins is challenging due to limited and sometimes contradictory historical records. However, we can provide some general information based on available data. 12. Sephardim. Sephardic Jews, who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century, had been present in Palestine for centuries. They formed a significant portion of the Jewish population in the region. Estimates suggest that Sephardim constituted a significant portion of the Jewish population in Palestine in 1912, likely numbering in the tens of thousands. 12. Mizrahi. Mizrahi Jews, originating from various Arab-speaking regions, also made up a substantial part of the Jewish population in Palestine. Their presence was particularly strong in cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. Estimates for the Mizrahi population in 1912 are similar to those for Sephardim, likely in the tens of thousands. 12. Ashkenazi, Yiddish-speaking. Ashkenazi Jews, who immigrated primarily from Eastern Europe, were a relatively recent addition to the Jewish community in Palestine. Their numbers increased significantly during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven by various factors, including persecution and economic hardship in Europe. Estimates suggest that Ashkenazi Jews made up a significant portion of the Jewish population in Palestine in 1912, likely numbering in the tens of thousands. However, their exact proportion compared to Sephardim and Mizrahi Jews is difficult to determine. It's important to note that these estimates are approximate and may vary depending on the specific sources and methodologies used. Additionally, there may have been some overlap between these groups, as individuals could have mixed ancestry or identify with multiple communities. Jewish communities in Palestine in 1912. As mentioned in my previous response, it's challenging to provide exact numerical figures for the Jewish population in Palestine in 1912, broken down by Sephardim, Mizrahi, and Ashkenazi. Historical records are often incomplete or inconsistent, making precise estimates difficult. However, based on available data, we can say that each of these three groups likely numbered in the tens of thousands. The relative proportions of each group may have varied over time, depending on factors such as immigration patterns, demographic trends, and social and political conditions. While we don't have specific numerical figures for each group at the beginning of the 20th century, we can infer that Ashkenazi Jews were likely a growing proportion of the Jewish population. This is due to the significant wave of immigration from Eastern Europe that occurred during this period. It's important to remember that these estimates are based on the best available historical evidence and may be subject to revision as new information becomes available. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. In 1492, the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Ferdinand and Ezabela, issued the Edict of Expulsion, which ordered the expulsion of all Jews from the Kingdom of Spain. This edict was a culmination of centuries of religious intolerance and persecution against the Jewish community in Spain. The Edict of Expulsion had a devastating impact on the Jewish community in Spain. Thousands of Jews were forced to leave their homes, businesses, and synagogues. Many faced discrimination, violence, and even death as they fled the country. There was no specific group or individual who protected the Jews during the expulsion. The edict was enforced by the Spanish government, and there were limited opportunities for Jews to resist or seek protection. The expelled Jews sought refuge in various parts of Europe and the Mediterranean. Many fled to Portugal, where they were initially tolerated but were later also expelled. Others migrated to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other parts of the Mediterranean basin. The expulsion of the Jews from Spain marked a significant turning point in Jewish history. It led to the diaspora of Sephardic Jews, who spread their culture, language, and traditions to new communities around the world. The The reception of Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. The Ottoman Empire and Arab North African communities generally welcomed the Sephardic Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal in the 15th century. These communities had a long history of religious tolerance and coexistence, and they often viewed the Sephardic Jews as valuable additions to their societies. Here are some of the ways in which the Ottoman Empire and Arab North African communities dealt with the influx of Sephardic Jews. Religious tolerance. Both the Ottoman Empire and Arab North African states were predominantly Muslim, but they generally practiced religious tolerance towards non-Muslims. This allowed Sephardic Jews to maintain their Jewish identity and practice their religion freely. Economic integration. Sephardic Jews often brought with them valuable skills and knowledge, particularly in commerce and trade. They were often welcomed into the local economies and integrated into the business communities. Cultural exchange. The arrival of Sephardic Jews contributed to cultural exchange and enrichment. They introduced new languages, customs, and traditions, which had a lasting impact on the societies they joined. Social integration. While there were some instances of discrimination and prejudice, Sephardic Jews generally integrated into the social fabric of their new communities. They formed their own Jewish communities, but they also interacted with the broader society and participated in local affairs. Overall, the reception of Sephardic Jews in the Ottoman Empire and Arab North Africa was largely positive. Their arrival contributed to the cultural and economic diversity of these regions and helped to strengthen the Jewish diaspora. You're right that Syrian Jews weren't as widely known for their expansive trade networks compared to Moroccan Jews. There were several factors contributing to this difference. Geographic location. Morocco. Situated on the western tip of North Africa, Morocco served as a major trading hub between Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. This geographical advantage allowed Moroccan Jews to develop extensive trade routes, particularly in gold, salt, and textiles. Syria. While Syria had access to the Mediterranean Sea, it wasn't as directly involved in the major east-west trade routes compared to Morocco. Trade in Syria tended to be more regional, focusing on goods within the Ottoman Empire or nearby lands. Historical context. Morocco. From the 17th to 19th centuries, Morocco had relatively stable centralized power under strong sultans. This stability allowed Jewish communities to flourish and participate actively in trade without major disruptions. Syria. Syria, on the other hand, experienced periods of political instability and power struggles within the Ottoman Empire. This could have created a less secure environment for merchants, impacting the growth of large-scale trade networks by Syrian Jews. Internal community dynamics. Morocco. Some scholars suggest that Moroccan Jewish communities may have developed a stronger emphasis on commerce due to restrictions on land ownership. This could have driven them towards professions like trade and finance. Syria. While Syrian Jews were involved in trade, other professions like crafts and artisanship might have been more prominent within their communities. Additionally, some Syrian Jewish communities focused on religious scholarship and scholarship. Limited sources. It's important to note that historical scholarship on Jewish communities in the Middle East tends to focus more on Egypt and Iraq compared to Syria. This could contribute to an impression of Syrian Jews not being as prominent in trade. Treatment by the majority. There's no evidence of widespread discriminatory policies specifically targeting Syrian Jews that would explain their lower involvement in large-scale trade. The Ottoman Empire's millet system generally allowed religious minorities like Jews to practice their religion and engage in economic activities. However, the overall economic and political climate certainly played a role in the opportunities available to Jewish communities. Conclusion. While Syrian Jews did participate in commerce and trade, their involvement wasn't as widely known compared to Moroccan Jews due to geographical location, historical context, and the focus of historical research. Sephardic Jewish involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The involvement of Sephardic Jews in the transatlantic slave trade is a complex and controversial issue. While there is evidence that some Sephardic Jews participated in this trade, it is important to note that this was not a universal practice within the Sephardic community. The transatlantic slave trade was a massive historical phenomenon that involved many different individuals and groups, including European powers, African kingdoms and societies, and enslaved Africans themselves. Sephardic Jews, as part of the broader Mediterranean trading network, were involved in various aspects of this trade, but their role was not always direct or central. Here are some key points to consider. Indirect involvement. Sephardic Jews were often involved in the broader economic and commercial networks that supported the slave trade. They may have provided financial services, transportation, or other logistical support to slave traders. Mediation. In some cases, Sephardic Jews acted as intermediaries between European slave traders and African kingdoms or societies. They may have negotiated the purchase of enslaved people or facilitated the transportation of slaves to the Americas. Limited control. It is important to note that Sephardic Jews, despite their involvement in the slave trade, did not have direct control over the enslavement process or the conditions faced by enslaved people. They were often subject to the same economic and political forces that drove the slave trade. The history of the transatlantic slave trade is complex and multifaceted. It involved many different individuals and groups, each with their own motivations and circumstances. While Sephardic Jews were involved in some aspects of this trade, their role was not always direct or central. It is important to consider the broader historical context and the complex interplay of factors that contributed to the development and continuation of the slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex historical phenomenon involving many different individuals and groups. There is no single creator of slavery, but rather a confluence of factors and actors that contributed to its development and perpetuation. Here are some key factors that contributed to the transatlantic slave trade. European colonization. The expansion of European empires in the Americas, Africa, and other parts of the world created a demand for labor to work on plantations and other colonial enterprises. Economic incentives. The profit motive was a powerful driver of the slave trade. European powers sought to exploit the resources of colonized lands, and enslaved Africans were seen as a valuable commodity to meet the labor demands of plantations and other industries. Racial ideology. Racist beliefs and ideologies justified the enslavement of Africans, portraying them as inferior and deserving of subjugation. These beliefs were used to rationalize the exploitation of enslaved people and to maintain a system of racial hierarchy. African participation. While the slave trade was driven by European demand, it also involved the participation of African kingdoms and societies. Some African rulers and merchants participated in the trade, either by capturing and selling enslaved people or by facilitating their transportation to European markets. It is important to note that the transatlantic slave trade was a system of oppression and exploitation that caused immense suffering to millions of enslaved Africans. It was a violation of human rights and a stain on human history. While there were individuals who profited from the slave trade, it was a system that was driven by broader economic, political, and social factors. It's important to understand that discussing the Israeli Jewish population solely in terms of skin color can be misleading and perpetuate harmful stereotypes. Jewish identity is complex and multifaceted, encompassing religious, cultural, and historical dimensions. Focusing solely on skin color ignores this rich diversity. That being said, Israel's Jewish population is not homogeneous in terms of skin color. There are significant communities of Jews of color, including Ethiopian Jews. These Jews have lived in Ethiopia for centuries and have distinct cultural and religious traditions. They were airlifted to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s as part of Operation Solomon and Operation Joshua. Mizrahi Jews. This term refers to Jews who originated in Arab-speaking countries, including North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Many Mizrahi Jews have darker skin tones compared to Ashkenazi Jews, who primarily immigrated from Europe. While accurate statistics on the percentage of Jews with black skin color in Israel are difficult to obtain, it is estimated that Ethiopian Jews constitute around 1% of the total Israeli population. Mizrahi Jews make up a much larger percentage, with estimates ranging from 30% to 50%. It is important to note that skin color is not a definitive indicator of Jewish identity. Many Jews of color may not identify with their skin color as a primary aspect of their identity. Instead, they may emphasize their Jewish heritage, religious practices, and cultural traditions. Additionally, there is a growing awareness of the diversity within the Jewish community, and the term Jews of color is increasingly used to describe Jews from non-white racial and ethnic backgrounds. This term acknowledges the diversity of experiences and perspectives within the Jewish community and challenges the notion of a monolithic Jewish identity. It's challenging to provide an accurate estimate of the percentage of Jewish people involved in the transatlantic slave trade. While there is evidence that some Sephardic Jews participated in this trade, it was not a universal practice within the Jewish community. The transatlantic slave trade involved a vast network of individuals and groups, including European powers, African kingdoms and societies, and enslaved Africans themselves. Sephardic Jews, as part of the broader Mediterranean trading network, were involved in various aspects of this trade, but their role was not always direct or central. The available historical records do not provide a clear breakdown of the religious affiliations of all individuals involved in the slave trade. While there is evidence that some Sephardic Jews participated, it is important to note that they were not the only group involved. European powers, African kingdoms and societies, and enslaved Africans themselves all played roles in the slave trade. Therefore, it is impossible to say with certainty what percentage of the millions of slaves sold during the transatlantic period were sold by Jewish individuals. It is likely that the percentage was relatively small, as the slave trade was a complex phenomenon involving many different actors and groups. While there are historical accounts of Jewish individuals involved in the transatlantic slave trade, there is no specific individual I can name whose grandfather was sold into slavery. Such a connection would be highly unusual given the historical context of Jewish communities in Europe and the Mediterranean, which were generally not involved in the direct enslavement of Africans. It is important to note that the transatlantic slave trade was a complex historical phenomenon involving many different individuals and groups, including European powers, African kingdoms and societies, and enslaved Africans themselves. While some Sephardic Jews were involved in various aspects of this trade, their role was not always direct or central. The available historical records do not provide a clear picture of individual Jewish involvement in the slave trade, and it is difficult to identify specific individuals with such a direct connection. Religious demographics of Palestine in 1912. Based on the estimates you provided, the religious demographics of Palestine in 1912 were approximately as follows. Muslim, 700,000 people. Jewish, 60,000 people. To calculate the percentages, we can use the following formula. Percentage equals specific group population, total population, *100. Muslim population percentage, 700,000 760,000, *100 approximately equals 92.1%. Jewish population percentage, 60,000 760,000, *100 approximately equals 7.9%. Therefore, approximately 92.1% of the population in Palestine in 1912 was Muslim, while 7.9% was Jewish. Please note that these are approximate figures based on the estimates you provided. The actual demographics may have varied slightly. Religious demographics of Palestine in 1912. While the primary religious groups in Palestine in 1912 were Muslims and Jews, there was also a small but significant Christian population. Christians had been present in the region for centuries, dating back to the early days of Christianity. Estimates for the Christian population in Palestine in 1912 vary, but it is generally believed to have been around 5% to 10% of the total population. This would correspond to approximately 38,000 to 76,000 Christians. Therefore, the approximate religious demographics of Palestine in 1912 were as follows. Muslim, 92.1%. Jewish, 7.9%. Christian, 5% to 10%. Please note that these are approximate figures and may vary slightly depending on the specific sources and methodologies used.